The mountain man saw her from across the snowy clearing. A woman on her knees removing her own woolen cloak to wrap around the shaking shoulders of a child who looked half frozen, and something in his chest twisted hard enough to steal his breath in the bitter Wyoming winter of 1878. Cade Yancey had been trapping beaver and hunting elk in these mountains for 6 years, ever since he'd left civilization behind at 22. And in all that time, he'd grown accustomed to solitude, to the silence of snow falling through pine branches, to the company of nothing but his own thoughts and the occasional wolf howling in the distance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, his broad shoulders draped in furs he'd tanned himself, his long dark hair hanging past his collar, streaked with ice crystals from the storm that had been raging for 2 days. The muscles in his arms and chest had been built from years of chopping wood, hauling water and wrestling animals twice the size of most men, and his hands were calloused and scarred from the hard work of surviving in a wilderness that showed no mercy to the weak. He'd come down from his cabin higher up the mountain to check his trap lines when he'd spotted the wagon overturned in a snowdrift, one wheel broken clean off, the horse nowhere to be seen. At first he'd thought everyone had abandoned it, headed back toward the settlement at South Pass City, 15 miles east. But then he'd seen movement near the wagon bed and approached cautiously, his rifle ready in case of trouble. What he found instead was the woman, her blonde hair escaping from beneath a simple bonnet, her dress thin and inadequate for the freezing temperatures, and the child, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8, his lips blue with cold. Another figure lay motionless against the wagon, an older woman wrapped in blankets, her face pale as the snow around them. The young woman looked up at Cade's approach, her green eyes wide with fear and something else, something desperate and determined. She positioned herself between him and the child instinctively, even though she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. "Please," she said, her voice cracking. "Please, if you have any mercy, help the boy. His grandmother, she's very ill. Our wagon broke, and our horse ran off, and we've been here since yesterday trying to stay warm, but I cannot get a fire started with everything so wet." Cade lowered his rifle immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. The woman had given her cloak to the child even though she was freezing herself, even though the cold could kill her just as easily. He'd never seen such selflessness, not in the cities where people stepped over the suffering in the streets, not even among the few trappers and hunters he occasionally encountered who valued their own survival above all else. "How long has she been like this?" Cade asked, gesturing to the older woman. "Since this morning. She stopped responding around dawn." The young woman's voice broke completely then. "I think she might be dying." Cade moved quickly, years of wilderness living making him efficient in crisis. He knelt beside the older woman, pressing his fingers to her neck. Her pulse was there but weak, her breathing shallow. Hypothermia and advanced. He pulled one of the thick beaver pelts from his pack and wrapped it around her, then another around the shaking child. "Your name," he said to the young woman. "Grace Harper. This is my nephew Timothy, and that's my mother, Margaret Harper. We were traveling from Fort Bridger to South Pass City where my brother lives, but the storm caught us yesterday afternoon." "Cade Yancey," he said shortly. "My cabin's 2 miles north up the slope. It's warm, got a good fire and supplies, but we need to move now. Your mother does not have much time." Grace nodded, her whole body trembling. Cade shrugged out of the massive grizzly bear fur he wore over his leather coat and draped it around Grace's shoulders. The fur was so large it nearly swallowed her, hanging down to her ankles. She looked up at him with surprise and gratitude, her eyes filling with tears. "I cannot take your coat," she protested. "You'll freeze." "I've got layers and I'm used to this cold," Cade said, which was true enough. His body had adapted over years to temperatures that would kill softer men. You need it more than me right now. He gathered Margaret Harper in his arms, the older woman weighing almost nothing, and stood easily despite the burden. His strength had been tested by carrying elk carcasses and hauling logs, and this was nothing by comparison. "Timothy, you walk close beside Miss Grace," Cade instructed. "Hold onto her hand and do not let go. Grace, you keep that fur wrapped tight and follow right behind me. I know the path even in this snow. We move steady and we'll be at the cabin before dark." Grace pulled Timothy close, wrapping them both in the enormous grizzly fur, and they set off through the snow. Cade led them with sure steps, his boots breaking trail through drifts that came up to his knees. The wind howled through the pines, driving snow into their faces, but he never wavered, never hesitated. He'd walked this path 1,000 times in all weather, and he could have found his way blindfolded. Behind him, he heard Grace encouraging Timothy, telling him stories to keep his mind off the cold, singing soft songs when the boy started to cry. Her voice was gentle and warm, full of love for the child, and Cade found himself listening to the sound of it, letting it fill the silence he'd lived in for so long. The climb was steep in places, and Cade heard Grace stumble more than once, but each time she caught herself and kept going, never complaining, never asking him to slow down. He respected that. The wilderness demanded strength, and she was showing hers even though she had to be exhausted and terrified. When the cabin finally came into view, nestled against a rock face with smoke still rising from the chimney, Cade heard Grace let out a small sob of relief. He kicked open the door, which he never bothered to lock since there was no one around for miles to steal from him, and carried Margaret inside. The cabin was a single large room, warm from the fire he'd built that morning before heading out. Furs and pelts lined the walls, both for insulation and because he hadn't yet taken them to trade. A large bed stood in one corner, a rough-hewn table and chairs near the fireplace, shelves holding supplies and tools. It was simple but solid, built with his own hands from logs he'd felled and chinked with mud and moss. Cade laid Margaret on his bed, then immediately set about building up the fire, adding more wood until flames roared high. Grace ushered Timothy to the hearth, wrapping him in more furs that Cade pulled from his stores. There were dozens of them, beaver and fox and wolf, elk hide and deer skin, the products of years of trapping. "We need to warm her slowly," Cade said, pulling off Margaret's wet outer clothes and replacing them with dry furs. "Too fast and it can shock the heart. Timothy, you get those wet boots off and put your feet near the fire. Grace, there's a pot on the hook there. Fill it with water from that barrel and set it to boil. We'll make hot broth." Grace moved to obey, her hands still shaking but her movements purposeful. Cade watched her from the corner of his eye as he tended to Margaret, noting how she worked without complaint despite her own exhaustion, how she checked on Timothy every few moments, how she moved with a natural grace even in her weakened state. She was beautiful, he realized, though that was almost irrelevant compared to the strength of character he'd already witnessed. Her face was delicate but determined, her blonde hair falling in damp waves down her back as she removed her bonnet. She couldn't have been more than 24 or 25, young but not a girl, with the kind of quiet resilience that came from facing hardship and not breaking under it. "How did you end up on that road in such a storm?" Cade asked as he worked. Grace filled the pot and hung it over the fire, then came to kneel beside the bed, taking her mother's cold hand in both of hers. "We left Fort Bridger 4 days ago. The weather was clear, and the man who hired on as our driver said he knew the route well. But when the storm started yesterday, He took our horse and rode off, left us there with the wagon and all our belongings. Anger flared hot in Cade's chest. He abandoned you, said he wasn't going to die for strangers, that we should have paid him more if we expected loyalty. Grace's voice was bitter. He took the horse and half our food supplies. My mother tried to stop him, and I think the strain of it, combined with the cold, was too much for her heart. She's been frail since my father died last year. Cade's hands clenched into fists. He'd met men like that, cowards who preyed on the vulnerable and called it survival. If he ever encountered the driver, there would be a reckoning. Your brother in South Pass City, he's expecting you, Cade asked. Yes, Thomas Harper, he works at the Carissa mine. He sent us money to make the journey after our farm in Illinois failed. We were supposed to arrive 3 days ago. He'll be worried sick. Storm's supposed to break tomorrow, Cade said. When it does, I'll take you to South Pass City myself. It's a hard walk, but my horses can carry your mother on a travois and Timothy can ride. You have horses? Grace looked surprised. 2 in the shelter behind the cabin. Mountain breeds used to the cold and the terrain. Cade checked Margaret's pulse again. It was slightly stronger now, her breathing a bit deeper. I think she's going to make it. She's warming up and her color's better. Grace's face crumpled with relief and tears spilled down her cheeks. She bent over her mother's hand, pressing it to her forehead. Thank God. Thank God and thank you, Mr. Yancey. If you hadn't found us, we would have died out there. Cade, he said gruffly, uncomfortable with her gratitude even though it warmed something in him that had been cold for years. Just Cade. Then you must call me Grace. She looked up at him, her green eyes shimmering with tears and firelight. You saved our lives. I can never repay such a debt. You don't owe me anything, Cade said. He stood and moved to the shelves, pulling down strips of dried elk meat and a sack of beans. But you can help by making sure that broth gets made and everyone eats something hot. There's bread in that tin, a couple days old but still good, and I've got honey to go with it. Grace rose and set to work, and Cade found himself watching her move around his cabin, bringing life and warmth to a space that had been nothing but functional for so long. Timothy curled up near the fire, wrapped in furs, his eyes growing heavy as the warmth seeped back into his small body. Uncle Cade, the boy said sleepily. I'm not your uncle, son, Cade said, but his voice was gentle. Can I call you that anyway? You saved us like a hero, and Aunt Grace says heroes are worth respecting. Cade glanced at Grace, who was blushing as she stirred the pot. You can call me whatever you like, he told Timothy. Now sleep. You're safe here. The boy was asleep within minutes, and Grace continued working, mixing the broth with practiced ease, slicing the bread, setting out tin cups and plates. When everything was ready, she brought a cup to Cade where he sat watching over Margaret. You should eat too, she said softly. You carried my mother 2 miles through a blizzard. You must be exhausted. Cade took the cup, his fingers brushing against hers, and felt a jolt of something electric pass between them. Grace felt it too. He could tell by the way her breath caught, the way her eyes widened slightly. But she stepped back, maintaining a proper distance, and Cade respected that even as part of him wanted to pull her closer, to feel if she was real and not some dream conjured by too many years alone. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and Margaret's steady breathing. When Grace had finished, she washed the dishes in a bucket of water, then came to sit in the chair Cade had pulled up beside the bed. You should sleep, Cade said. You can have the bed. I'll sit up with your mother and make sure she stays warm. I cannot take your bed, Grace protested. You can and you will. You're dead on your feet and Timothy's already asleep by the fire. I'll keep watch. When she looked like she might argue further, Cade added, I'm used to staying up all night. I do it often when I'm hunting or when the wolves get too close to the cabin. This is nothing. Grace finally nodded, too tired to fight. She climbed onto the bed beside her mother, wrapping herself in one of the heavy furs, and within minutes she too was asleep. Cade sat in the chair and watched over all three of them, these unexpected guests who had stumbled into his solitary life. The firelight played across Grace's face, softening her features, and he found himself memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way her hair spread across the pillow, the gentle rise and fall of her breathing. He'd forgotten what it was like to have people around, to be responsible for anyone but himself. 6 years ago, he'd fled to these mountains after watching his parents die of fever innocent. Louis tenement, after burying them in a pauper cemetery and realizing he had nothing and no one left in the world. The wilderness had seemed like the only place where the loneliness wouldn't hurt so much, where he could build something with his own hands and not depend on anyone else. But now, watching Grace sleep with the firelight dancing across her face, listening to Timothy's soft snores and Margaret's steady breathing, Cade felt something shift inside him. The loneliness hadn't gone away in 6 years. He'd just gotten used to it, built walls around it, told himself he didn't need human connection. Grace had broken through those walls in a single afternoon with nothing but her courage and her kindness, giving her cloak to a freezing child even though it meant she might die herself. Cade stood and added more wood to the fire, checked that everyone was warm enough, then settled back into his chair. The storm howled outside, rattling the shutters, but inside the cabin was warm and safe and full of sleeping people who trusted him to protect them. He wouldn't let them down. Morning came gray and cold, the storm still raging. Cade had dozed fitfully in the chair, waking every hour to check on his patients and tend the fire. Margaret stirred around dawn, her eyes fluttering open, confusion and fear crossing her face before Grace was there, taking her hand, speaking softly. "Mother, it's all right. We're safe. A man named Cade found us and brought us to his cabin." Margaret's eyes found Cade where he stood by the fire. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice rough. "My daughter, Timothy, are they well?" "Both fine, madam," Cade assured her. "You're the one who gave us a scare, but you're warming up now and I think you'll recover." "I feel like I've been trampled by a team of horses," Margaret said, but there was a hint of humor in her voice. "Where are we?" 2 miles north of where your wagon broke down, up in the mountains. My cabin." Cade ladled out hot broth from the pot he'd kept simmering all night. "You should drink this, get your strength back." Grace helped her mother sit up, and Margaret drank the broth slowly, color gradually returning to her face. Timothy woke and immediately ran to his grandmother, throwing his arms around her neck. "Grandma, you're awake. I was so scared." "I'm all right, my darling boy," Margaret soothed, stroking his hair. "Thanks to Mr. Yancey and your brave aunt." The day passed slowly, the storm keeping them all confined to the cabin. Cade was used to small spaces and his own company, but having 3 other people in the cabin made it feel tiny. Yet he didn't mind the way he thought he would. Grace moved around his space with unconscious ease, helping Margaret, entertaining Timothy with stories and simple games, cooking meals from his stores. She insisted on earning their keep, mending a tear in one of Cade's shirts that he'd been ignoring for months, organizing his supplies, even scrubbing the floor, though he told her it wasn't necessary. "You've given us shelter and probably saved our lives," she said firmly. "The least I can do is help maintain your home." "It's just a cabin," Cade said. "It's a beautiful cabin," Grace corrected. "You built it yourself. Every log and plank. Took me the better part of a year." Cade ran his hand over the smooth wood of the table. "I'm not much for carpentry, but it's held up well enough. It's more than well built. It's a home." Grace's eyes roamed over the space, taking in the furs, the carefully organized tools, the little touches that made it comfortable. "You've made a good life here." "It's a lonely life," Cade said before he could stop himself. Grace looked at him with understanding in her green eyes. "Is that why you came to the mountains? To be alone, at first?" "After my parents died, I couldn't stand to be around people, around the noise and the dirt and the constant struggle just to survive in the city. Out here, I can breathe. I can build and hunt and trap, and I don't have to depend on anyone." "But you miss people," Grace said softly. "I can see it in your eyes when you watch Timothy playing or when you listen to my mother's stories. You miss connection." Cade was silent for a long moment. "Maybe I do," he finally admitted, "but I don't know if I remember how to live any other way now." "I think you do," Grace said. "You showed nothing but kindness and gentleness since the moment you found us. That's not a man who's forgotten how to connect with people. That's a man who's been waiting for the right people to come along." Her words settled into his chest, warm and bright. Cade met her eyes and saw something there that made his heart beat faster, a softness and interest that mirrored what he'd been feeling. "Tell me about your life," he said, wanting to know everything about her. "Your farm in Illinois, your family, how you ended up on that road in a blizzard." Grace settled into the chair across from him, and as the storm raged outside, she talked. She told him about the small farm she'd grown up on, about her father who died in a farming accident the previous year, about the drought that had destroyed their crops and left them with nothing. She spoke of her brother Thomas, who'd gone west 2 years earlier to find work in the mines, and how he'd sent money for his mother, sister, and nephew to join him once he'd established himself. "My sister died giving birth to Timothy," Grace said quietly, her hands folded in her lap. "Her husband had already been killed in the war when she found out she was with child. So I've raised Timothy since he was born. He's my son in every way that matters, even if I didn't give birth to him." "He's lucky to have you," Cade said. "I can see how much you love him." "He's everything to me," Grace said simply. "When we lost the farm, when we had nothing left, the thought of giving him a better life in a new place was what kept me going. And then when that driver abandoned us, when I thought we might freeze to death before anyone found us, all I could think was that I'd failed him, failed to keep him safe." "You didn't fail. You kept him alive until I found you. You gave him your cloak even though it meant you'd freeze." "That's not failure, Grace, that's love." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "I would have died for him. I would have given anything." "I know," Cade said, and he reached across the table to take her hand. Her fingers were small and delicate in his calloused palm, but he felt the strength in them, the resilience. "That's the first thing I noticed about you before I even saw your face. The way you protected him, gave him warmth even though you were freezing. I'd never seen anything like it." Grace's fingers tightened around his. "You gave me your furs, your warmth, your home. You're protecting all of us now. That's love too, isn't it?" "I suppose it is," Cade said, though the word felt strange in his mouth. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it meant to care for someone, to want to protect them not out of obligation, but because the thought of them suffering caused him pain. They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, while Margaret dozed in the bed and Timothy played with carved wooden animals Cade had made on long winter nights. The storm continued, but inside the cabin, something warm and bright was growing, something neither of them could name yet, but both could feel. The blizzard broke on the second day, the wind dying to a whisper, and the snow falling softly instead of in blinding sheets. Cade went out to check on his horses, breaking a path through drifts that came up to his chest in places. The animals were fine, safe in the shelter he'd built for them, and he spent time grooming them and preparing them for the journey to South Pass City. When he came back inside, Grace had cooked a meal of biscuits and gravy, using the last of his fresh flour. The cabin smelled like home, like the childhood he'd almost forgotten, and for a moment Cade just stood in the doorway breathing it in. "We should leave tomorrow morning," he said. "The snow's stopped, and the path will be passable if we start early. It'll take most of the day to reach South Pass City, but we can make it before dark if we don't run into trouble." "You're still willing to take us?" Margaret asked. She'd recovered well, though she was still weak. "We've already imposed so much on your kindness." "It's no imposition," Cade said. "Besides, I need to go to town anyway, trade some of these furs. I've got enough piled up here to stock a mercantile." That night, their last in the cabin together, felt different. There was an unspoken awareness between Cade and Grace, a knowledge that tomorrow would bring an ending to something that had barely begun. Grace was quiet as she prepared for bed, and Cade found himself memorizing everything about her, the way she moved, the sound of her voice, the gentle smile she gave Timothy as she tucked him in by the fire. "Cade," she said softly as he banked the fire for the night. "May I speak with you outside for a moment?" He nodded and followed her out onto the small porch he'd built, where the night air was crisp and cold and the stars blazed overhead like diamonds scattered across black velvet. Grace wrapped one of his furs around her shoulders and stood looking out at the moonlit landscape. "I don't want to leave," she said quietly. "I know that's foolish. I know I have to go to my brother, that I have responsibilities and a life waiting for me in South Pass City. But these past 2 days, staying here with you, it's felt more like home than anywhere I've been since my father died." Cade's heart was hammering so hard he thought she must be able to hear it. "It's felt like home to me too," he admitted. "I've been alone in this cabin for 6 years, and I thought I liked it that way. But having you here, having people around, it's made me realize how much I've been missing." Grace turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "What if I stayed?" she whispered. "What if I sent word to Thomas that we're safe, that we've found a place to live, and I just stayed here with you?" "Grace," Cade said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "You don't know what you're asking. Life up here is hard. It's isolated and dangerous, and there's no society, no neighbors for miles, no church or school or any of the things you're used to." "I'm used to hard work," Grace said. "I'm used to making do with little. What I'm not used to, what I haven't had since my father died, is feeling safe. Feeling cared for. You've given me that in just 2 days, Cade. You've given all of us warmth and protection and kindness, asked for nothing in return. That's more valuable than any comfort civilization can offer." Cade wanted to pull her into his arms, to kiss her and promise her everything, but he held back. "What about Timothy? What about your mother? They deserve better than a rough mountain cabin." "Timothy adores you," Grace said. "He's been happier these past 2 days than I've seen him in months. And my mother is getting older, weaker. She needs a safe place to rest and recover, not the chaos of a mining town. Please, Cade, let us stay. Let me stay." "You barely know me," Cade protested, but his resistance was crumbling. "I know you saved our lives. I know you gave me furs and warmth when I was freezing. I know you're strong and capable and kind, and that when you look at me, I feel something I've never felt before." Grace stepped closer, laying her hand on his chest. "I know that I'm falling in love with you, and I think maybe you feel the same way." Cade covered her hand with his, feeling his heart beating beneath their joined palms. "I do," he said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "I've been falling for you since I saw you take off your cloak for that child. Everything you've done since then has only made it stronger. But Grace, I need you to be sure. I need you to think about what you're giving up." "I'm not giving anything up," Grace said firmly. "I'm choosing something better. I'm choosing a life with a man who I believe I could love for all my days. I'm choosing a home for Timothy and a safe place for my mother. I'm choosing you, Cade Yancey, if you'll have me." Cade pulled her into his arms then, unable to resist any longer. She came willingly, fitting against him like she'd been made for that exact space, her head tucked under his chin, her arms wrapped around his waist. She was so small compared to him, delicate and feminine, but he could feel the strength in her, the determination that had kept her alive through hardship and loss. "I'll have you," he said into her hair. "God help me. I'll have you and cherish you and protect you for as long as I live. But we do this right. We go to South Pass City tomorrow, we talk to your brother, we make sure everyone knows you're making this choice freely and with full knowledge of what it means. And then, if you still want to come back here, we'll get married proper and make a life together." Grace pulled back just enough to look up at him, her face radiant with joy. "Married? If you're staying in my cabin, sharing my life, then you're going to be my wife," Cade said firmly. "I won't have it any other way. I won't have anyone thinking poorly of you or saying you're anything less than the respectable woman you are." "Then yes," Grace said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you, Cade Yancey. I'll be your wife and build a life with you in these mountains, and I'll be grateful for every moment of it." Cade bent his head and kissed her then, gentle at first and then deeper as she responded, her hands sliding up to tangle in his long hair. She tasted like hope and new beginnings, like everything he'd thought he'd lost when he'd fled to the wilderness. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cade rested his forehead against hers. "We should go inside before we freeze," he said. "I don't think I could freeze now if I tried," Grace said, but she let him lead her back into the cabin. That night, Cade slept in his chair again while Grace curled up beside her mother and Timothy slept by the fire, but the cabin felt different now. It felt like the beginning of something instead of a temporary shelter, like a home that was about to be filled with laughter and love, and all the things Cade had thought he'd never have again. Morning came clear and bright, the sky a brilliant blue, the snow sparkling like crushed diamonds. Cade loaded his travois with furs and secured it to his larger horse, a sturdy gelding named Brutus. Margaret would ride on a pile of furs laid across the travois, comfortable and warm. Timothy could ride Cade's smaller mare, Daisy, while Cade and Grace would walk, breaking trail through the snow. The journey was slow but steady. Cade knew every inch of this route, had traveled it dozens of times on his infrequent trips to town to trade furs and buy supplies. Grace walked beside him, wearing the grizzly fur he'd given her, her hand occasionally reaching out to touch his arm as if assuring herself he was real. They talked as they walked, sharing stories of their lives, their dreams, their fears. Cade told her about growing up in St. Louis, about watching the city grow and change, about the fever epidemic that had taken his parents and hundreds of others. Grace told him about her childhood on the farm, about the sister she'd lost, about the joy Timothy had brought into her life even in the midst of grief. "What will you tell your brother?" Cade asked as South Pass City came into view in the valley below, its buildings huddled together against the cold, smoke rising from dozens of chimneys. "The truth," Grace said. "That I've met a good man who saved my life and asked me to marry him, and that I've said yes. Thomas will want to meet you, of course. He'll want to make sure you're worthy of his sister." "And if he decides I'm not," Cade asked. Grace squeezed his arm. "Then he'll be wrong and I'll marry you anyway. But I think he'll see what I see." How could he not? South Pass City was a rough mining town, all mud streets and hastily constructed buildings, saloons and supply stores and boarding houses. Cade led them to the largest boarding house, knowing the owner and trusting her to be discreet and kind. Mrs. Alina Fitzgerald was a widow who'd made her way west after her husband died in the war, and she ran a clean, respectable establishment. "Cade Yancey," she exclaimed when she saw him. "I haven't seen you in 4 months. I was starting to think the wolves had gotten you." "Still alive and kicking, Mrs. Fitz," Cade said. "I've got some folks who need rooms and a hot meal. This is Grace Harper, her mother Margaret, and her nephew Timothy. They had some trouble on the road, and I brought them in from my cabin." Mrs. Fitzgerald's sharp eyes took in the situation immediately, noting the way Grace stood close to Cade, the furs she wore, the protective way Cade positioned himself between the Harper family and the rough men on the street. Of course. Come in, all of you. Let's get you settled." She bustled them inside, and within an hour Margaret was tucked into a warm bed, Timothy was eating fresh bread and jam in the kitchen, and Grace was washing the trail dust from her face in a room that Mrs. Fitzgerald had given her. Cade waited in the parlor, his hat in his hands, until Grace came down the stairs wearing a clean dress that Mrs. Fitzgerald had loaned her. She looked different in proper clothing, more refined somehow, and for a moment Cade felt the gap between them, the difference between a mountain man who lived in a cabin and a respectable young woman who deserved fine things. But then Grace smiled at him, that warm, genuine smile that lit up her whole face, and she crossed the room to take his hands. "Mrs. Fitzgerald says my brother lives 2 streets over above the assayer's office," Grace said. "Will you come with me to see him?" "If you want me to," Cade said. "I want you to," Grace said firmly. "You're going to be my husband. He should meet you now." They walked through the muddy streets together, and Cade was aware of the stares they drew, the mountain man in his furs and buckskin and the lovely blonde woman at his side. South Pass City wasn't large enough for secrets, and by nightfall, everyone in town would know that Cade Yancey had brought a woman down from the mountains. Thomas Harper turned out to be a tall, thin man in his early 30s, with the same blonde hair and green eyes as his sister. He opened the door to his small apartment above the assayer's office and stared in shock at the sight of Grace standing there. "Grace, thank God!" He pulled her into a fierce hug. "I've been out of my mind with worry. You were supposed to be here 4 days ago." "I was about to organize a search party. I'm sorry, Thomas. We had trouble on the road. Our driver abandoned us when the storm hit and our wagon broke down." Grace pulled back and gestured to Cade. "This is Cade Yancey. He found us and saved our lives, brought us to his cabin and cared for us until the storm passed. Mother and Timothy are safe at Mrs. Fitzgerald's boarding house." Thomas's eyes went to Cade, assessing and suspicious in the way of protective older brothers. "Mr. Yancey, I'm deeply grateful for what you did for my family." "Just Cade," he said, shaking the other man's hand. "And I did what anyone would do." "Not anyone," Grace said. "Most men would have passed us by or demanded payment we couldn't give. Cade asked for nothing and gave us everything. And now, Thomas, I need to tell you something." She explained quickly and clearly, her voice steady, about the 2 days in the cabin, about her decision to stay with Cade, about their intention to marry. Thomas's face went through a series of expressions: shock, concern, protectiveness, and finally resignation. "Grace, are you certain about this?" he asked. "You've only known this man for 3 days." "I'm certain," Grace said. "I know it seems sudden, but I've never been more sure of anything. Cade is a good man, Thomas. He's strong and capable and kind, and he's offering me and Timothy a home, a real home. I love him." Thomas looked at Cade. "What are your intentions toward my sister?" "To marry her proper, in a church if there's one in this town, with witnesses and everything legal," Cade said. "To provide for her and protect her and Timothy and your mother for as long as I live." To build a life in my cabin that will be safe and warm and full of everything I can give them. You live in the mountains, Thomas said. It's isolated up there, dangerous. It is, Cade agreed. But I've survived there for 6 years and I know how to handle the dangers. I've got a good cabin, sturdy and warm with room enough for a family. I've got horses and traps and hunting skills, and I know how to trade my furs for supplies. We won't be rich, but we won't go hungry either. Thomas was silent for a long moment, studying Cade's face. Finally, he sighed. Grace has always been strong-willed. Once she makes up her mind about something, there's no changing it. And I can see she's made up her mind about you. So I suppose all I can do is give you my blessing and pray you treat her right. I will, Cade promised. On my life I will. Thomas pulled his sister into another hug. Be happy, Grace. That's all I've ever wanted for you. I will be, Grace said, her voice thick with tears. Come to the wedding and visit us when you can. I don't want to lose you, Thomas. You won't lose me. I'll visit and you can come to town when the weather's good. We're still family, Grace. We always will be. The wedding was arranged for 2 days later, giving Margaret time to recover her strength and giving Grace time to prepare. There was a small church in South Pass City, served by a circuit preacher who happened to be in town, and Mrs. Fitzgerald insisted on hosting a small reception at the boarding house. Cade used those 2 days to trade his furs, getting a good price for the beaver pelts and the fox furs, more than enough to buy supplies for the winter, and a simple gold ring for Grace. He also bought fabric for dresses, toys for Timothy, medicine for Margaret, and 100 other small things that he thought might make life in the cabin more comfortable. Grace spent the time with her mother and Timothy, helping Margaret regain her strength and explaining to the boy that they would be living with Cade now, that he would be like a father to Timothy. I like Cade, Timothy said. He's strong like a bear, but he's nice. Can I really call him Papa? If he says it's all right, Grace said, hugging the boy close. Would you like that? Yes, Timothy said decisively. I never had a papa before. I think I'll like it. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the kind of bright winter day that made everything seem crisp and new. Grace wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Fitzgerald had helped her make over from some fabric in the mercantile, and she carried a small bouquet of pine branches, tied with ribbon, since there were no flowers to be had in winter. Cade wore new clothes for the first time in years, dark trousers and a white shirt and a vest, though he kept his long hair and the beard he'd grown over the years. He looked different, cleaned up, more civilized somehow, but his eyes were the same when he saw Grace walking down the aisle toward him, warm and full of love and promise. The ceremony was simple and brief, the preacher's words echoing in the small church. Margaret sat in the front pew, tears streaming down her face, while Timothy stood beside Cade as his witness. Thomas gave his sister away with solemn dignity, and when the preacher said, "You may kiss your bride," Cade did so with a tenderness that made several of the women in attendance sigh. The reception at the boarding house was lively despite the small crowd. The townspeople who'd come were curious about the mountain man and his new bride, but they were friendly enough, and Cade found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't around people in years. "You've got yourself a good woman," one of the miners told him, clapping him on the shoulder. "Treat her right." "I intend to," Cade said. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Cade and Grace said their goodbyes. Margaret would stay at the boarding house with Timothy for another week, giving Grace and Cade time alone in the cabin to settle into married life. And then Cade would come back to collect them and bring them up to the mountain. The ride back to the cabin was quiet, both of them on horseback now, Brutus carrying Cade and his supplies while Grace rode Daisy. The path was easier than it had been on the journey down, The snow packed hard, and they made good time. When the cabin came into view, Cade felt a swell of pride and happiness. This was his home, and now it was Grace's too. He helped her down from the horse and carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition. Inside, the cabin was cold, the fire having gone out days ago, but Cade quickly built it back up until flames roared high and warmth filled the space. Grace unpacked the supplies they'd brought, her movements quick and efficient, already making the cabin her own. That night they sat by the fire, Grace curled against Cade's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest. The furs he'd given her that first day were spread over them both, and the cabin felt peaceful and right. "Are you happy?" Cade asked quietly. "Happier than I've ever been," Grace said. "I know that sounds impossible after only knowing you a few days, but it's true. I feel like I've been searching for something all my life, and I finally found it. I found you." Cade pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I gave you furs and warmth, but you gave me something more valuable. You gave me hope. You gave me a reason to come back down off this mountain and remember what it's like to be human, to care about someone more than I care about myself." "We gave each other what we needed most," Grace said. "That's what love is, isn't it? Seeing what someone needs and giving it freely, without expectation or demand." "I suppose it is," Cade agreed. "And I promise you, Grace, I'll spend every day of our life together trying to give you what you need. I'll protect you and provide for you and love you with everything I have." "I know you will," Grace said. "And I'll do the same for you. We'll build a good life here, Cade. I can feel it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire burn, and Cade thought about the future stretching out before them. It wouldn't always be easy, he knew that. Winters in the mountains were harsh, and there would be challenges and hardships they couldn't yet imagine. But they would face them together, this strong, brave woman and the mountain man who'd learned to love again. The week passed in a blur of happiness. Cade and Grace learned each other's rhythms, the small habits and preferences that make up a shared life. Grace reorganized the cabin with a woman's touch, hanging curtains she'd brought from town, arranging the furs more artfully, creating a sense of warmth and home that the cabin had never had before. Cade taught her how to handle the horses, how to check the traps, how to recognize the signs of approaching weather. Grace proved to be a quick learner, unafraid of hard work or getting her hands dirty. She could shoot a rifle well enough to hit what she aimed at, and she wasn't squeamish about skinning rabbits or preparing meat. "I grew up on a farm," she reminded him when he expressed surprise at her capabilities. "I know how to work." "You never stop amazing me," Cade said, and he meant it. At night, they lay in each other's arms in the big bed, talking until sleep claimed them, learning the intimacy of married life. Grace was gentle and loving, and Cade found himself opening up to her in ways he'd never opened up to anyone, sharing fears and dreams and memories he'd thought buried forever. When the week was up, Cade rode back down to South Pass City to collect Margaret and Timothy. The boy ran to him as soon as he saw him, throwing his arms around Cade's waist. "Papa Cade, you came back." The word Papa hit Cade right in the chest, bringing unexpected tears to his eyes. He knelt down to Timothy's level and hugged the boy properly. "Of course I came back. I promised I would, didn't I? And I always keep my promises." Margaret was well enough to travel, and Thomas came to see them off, helping his mother onto the travois and hugging his nephew tight. "Take care of them," he said to Cade. "With my life," Cade promised. The journey back up the mountain was joyful, Timothy chattering nonstop about everything he'd seen and done in town. Margaret smiling despite her exhaustion, and Cade feeling more complete than he had in years. When they arrived at the cabin, Grace ran out to meet them, pulling Timothy into a hug and helping her mother down from the travois. That night, the cabin was full for the first time. All four of them gathered around the fire, sharing a meal and telling stories. Timothy sat on Cade's lap, playing with the wooden animals Cade had carved, while Margaret and Grace worked on mending clothes and chatting about everything and nothing. This was family, Cade realized. This was what he'd been missing all those years alone. Not just companionship, but belonging, the knowledge that these people needed him and loved him, that he had a place and a purpose beyond mere survival. The winter deepened, and the small family settled into routines. Cade hunted and trapped, keeping them supplied with meat and furs. Grace cooked and cleaned and cared for her mother and Timothy, but she also accompanied Cade on his shorter trips, learning the land and the ways of the wilderness. Timothy thrived in the mountain air, growing stronger and healthier, his laughter ringing through the cabin and bringing joy to all of them. Margaret's health improved slowly but steadily. The peace and quiet of the cabin, the good food and warm shelter, the lack of stress and worry, all contributed to her recovery. She took on the role of grandmother and housekeeper, tending the fire when Cade and Grace were out, teaching Timothy his letters and numbers, making the cabin a home in ways both practical and emotional. Spring came late to the mountains, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a transformation. The snow melted, revealing meadows full of wildflowers. Game was plentiful, and Cade's traps were full. He made several trips to South Pass City to trade furs and buy supplies, always bringing back little treats for his family, candy for Timothy, fabric for Grace, a warm shawl for Margaret. On one of these trips, he ran into the driver who had abandoned the Harper family during the blizzard. The man was drunk in a saloon, bragging about how he'd outsmarted some fool women who'd wanted to pay him in promises instead of cash. Cade's vision went red. He crossed the saloon in 3 strides and grabbed the man by the front of his shirt, lifting him clear off his feet. "You abandoned a woman, a child, and a sick elderly lady in a blizzard," Cade said, his voice deadly quiet. "You left them to die." The man's eyes went wide with fear when he recognized Cade. "I didn't know they'd die. I just wanted to save myself." "They would have died if I hadn't found them," Cade said. "And you took their horse and their food, left them with nothing. You're lower than the wolves. At least they kill for hunger, not cowardice." He threw the man across the saloon, where he crashed into a table and collapsed. Cade stood over him, fists clenched. "If I ever see you again, if I even hear that you're within 100 miles of my family, I'll hunt you down and make you regret the day you were born. Understand?" The man nodded frantically, scrambling away. Cade turned and walked out of the saloon, his anger still burning but under control. He wouldn't become a violent man, wouldn't let rage control him, but he would protect his family with everything he had. When he told Grace about the encounter that night, she took his hands and kissed his bruised knuckles. "Thank you for defending us," she said, "but please be careful. I couldn't bear to lose you." "You won't," Cade promised. "I'll always come back to you." Summer brought long days and warm nights, and with it, news that made Grace's face light up with joy and trepidation in equal measure. She was with child, due sometime in the late winter or early spring. Cade was overwhelmed with emotion when she told him, pulling her into his arms and holding her tight, already imagining a son or daughter with Grace's blonde hair and green eyes. "Are you happy?" Grace asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Cade said. "Terrified, thrilled, grateful, all of those things. You're giving me a family, Grace. A real family." "We're giving each other a family," Grace corrected. "And we'll be wonderful parents, I know we will." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into the fall. Grace continued her normal activities as long as she could, helping with chores and even accompanying Cade on short trips. Margaret fussed over her daughter, making sure she rested enough and ate properly, while Timothy was excited about becoming a big brother. "I'll teach the baby everything I know," he told Cade seriously. "How to carve wood and track rabbits and everything." "I'm sure you will," Cade said, ruffling the boy's hair. "You'll be a good big brother." As winter approached again, Cade worked harder than ever, building an addition onto the cabin that would serve as a bedroom for Margaret and Timothy, giving the main room more space for the growing family. He hunted and trapped with renewed vigor, determined to have enough supplies to see them through the winter and the birth. Grace's belly swelled with the growing child, and Cade found himself constantly amazed by the miracle of it, this new life they'd created together. He would lay his hand on her stomach and feel the baby kick, and his heart would swell with love so strong it almost hurt. The winter was milder than the one before, though there were still storms that kept them confined to the cabin for days at a time. During these periods, they played games and told stories, worked on projects and enjoyed each other's company. The cabin rang with laughter and love, a far cry from the silent, lonely place it had been before Grace came into Cade's life. When Grace's time came, it was during a clear, cold night in February. Margaret took charge immediately, having helped birth dozens of babies on the farm and in their community. She sent Cade and Timothy out to the shelter to check on the horses, giving Grace privacy and keeping them from being underfoot. Cade paced in the snow, his heart racing, while Timothy sat on a bale of hay and watched him with wide eyes. "Is Aunt Grace going to be all right?" the boy asked. "She's going to be fine," Cade said, praying it was true. "Your grandmother knows what she's doing." The hours stretched endlessly, and Cade thought he might go mad from worry. But finally, just as dawn was breaking over the mountains, he heard a baby's cry, strong and healthy, piercing the cold morning air. He ran back to the cabin, Timothy at his heels, and burst through the door to find Grace propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft furs. Margaret stood nearby, beaming, her hands still busy with the cleanup. "You have a son," Grace said, her voice tired but full of joy. "A healthy, beautiful son." Cade approached the bed on shaking legs and looked down at the baby. He was tiny and red-faced, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn blue or green in time. He was perfect, absolutely perfect, and Cade felt his heart crack open with a love he'd never known was possible. "Can I hold him?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. Grace placed the baby in his arms and Cade cradled his son against his chest, feeling the tiny heartbeat, the soft warmth, the weight of this new life that depended on him. "What should we name him?" Grace asked. Cade thought of his father, dead these many years, a good man who'd worked himself to exhaustion trying to provide for his family. "Charles," he said. "Charles Harper Yancey, after my father and your family." "Charles," Grace repeated, smiling. "I love it. Welcome to the world, little Charles." The baby's arrival brought new challenges and new joys. Cade found himself waking multiple times a night to check on his son, to make sure he was breathing, to watch Grace nurse him and marvel at the bond between mother and child. Timothy was a devoted big brother, always wanting to hold the baby, to sing to him, to help with whatever was needed. Margaret continued to be a blessing, helping with the endless tasks that came with a newborn while Grace recovered her strength. The cabin that had once been built for solitude now overflowed with life and love and purpose. Spring came again, Charles's first spring, and Cade carried his son outside to see the wildflowers blooming in the meadows, to feel the warm sun on his face, to hear the birds singing in the trees. Grace walked beside them, her hand in Cade's free one, and they stood together looking out over the valley, the mountains rising all around them. "Are you happy?" Cade asked, the same question he'd asked on their wedding night. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Grace said. "When I gave my cloak to Timothy that day in the snow when I thought we were going to freeze to death, I never could have dreamed that it would lead to this. To you, to our family, to this beautiful life. I gave you furs and warmth," Cade said, remembering those early days. "But you gave me everything. You gave me love, family, purpose. You gave me a reason to build something instead of just surviving. You changed my life, Grace." "We changed each other's lives," Grace said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And we'll keep changing and growing together for all the years to come." As the years passed, that promise held true. Charles grew into a strong, curious boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. Grace and Cade had 2 more children, a daughter they named Clara and another son they called James. The cabin expanded again and again to accommodate the growing family, becoming a sprawling homestead that was known throughout the region as a place of warmth and hospitality. Thomas visited regularly, bringing news from South Pass City, and eventually bringing a wife of his own, a kind woman named Sarah who became fast friends with Grace. Margaret lived to see all her grandchildren born, passing peacefully in her sleep one winter night when Charles was 10, surrounded by the family who loved her. Timothy grew to manhood in the mountains, learning everything Cade could teach him about trapping and hunting and surviving in the wilderness. When he turned 20, he started his own homestead a few miles away, close enough to visit regularly but far enough to establish his independence. He married a girl from South Pass City and brought her to the mountains, starting his own family and continuing the legacy of strength and love that Grace and Cade had begun. Cade's hair turned gray. His beard went white, but his strength never failed him. He continued to trap and hunt, to provide for his family, to be the rock they all depended on. Grace aged gracefully, her beauty deepening into something richer and more profound. The beauty of a woman who has loved and been loved, who has built a life with her own hands and raised children to be good and strong. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Cade took Grace back to the spot where he'd first seen her, where she'd given her cloak to a freezing child in the snow. The wagon was long gone, rotted away or hauled off for scrap, but the place was the same, a clearing surrounded by pines, peaceful and beautiful. "You remember?" Cade asked, holding Grace's hand. "How could I forget?" Grace said, tears streaming down her face. "It was the day my life began. The day I met the man who would give me everything." "I gave you furs and warmth," Cade said, as he had said so many times over the years. "But you gave me love. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up every morning grateful to be alive. You saved me, Grace, as surely as I saved you from that blizzard." "We saved each other," Grace said, rising on her toes to kiss him. "And we'll keep saving each other every day for all time." They stood in the clearing as snow began to fall, gentle flakes drifting down from a gray sky, and Cade wrapped his arms around his wife, holding her close. Around them, the mountains rose eternal, the wilderness that had once been his refuge and was now his home, the place where he'd found not just survival but life, not just existence but love. Their children and grandchildren would tell the story for generations, of the mountain man who saw a woman sharing her cloak in the snow and knew he'd found his destiny, of how he gave her furs and warmth and a cabin in the mountains, and she gave him love and family and a reason to believe in tomorrow, of how 2 people who had nothing found everything in each other and built a legacy that would last long after they were gone. The snow fell softly, covering the clearing in fresh white, and Cade and Grace stood together in the quiet peace, their hearts beating in sync, their love as strong as the mountains themselves, enduring and eternal, a testament to the power of compassion and kindness and the courage to choose love even when the world is cold and harsh. When they finally walked back to the cabin, their children were waiting, the fire was burning bright, and the smell of dinner filled the air. Charles, now a young man of 25 with a wife and baby of his own, helped his father out of his coat. Clara, beautiful and bright at 22, poured tea for her mother. James, 15 and already nearly as tall as his father, set the table with practiced ease. Timothy arrived with his family, bringing laughter and stories, and the cabin that had once housed one lonely man now overflowed with 3 generations of love and life. They gathered around the expanded table that Cade had built with his own hands, passing food and sharing stories, the children squabbling gently while the adults talked and laughed. Grace looked around at the family she and Cade had built, at the life they'd created from nothing but determination and love, and felt a profound sense of peace. She'd given her cloak to a freezing child because it was the right thing to do, never imagining it would lead to this, to decades of happiness, and a family that would carry on long after she was gone. Cade caught her eye across the table and smiled, that same warm smile that had made her fall in love with him 25 years ago. His hand found hers under the table, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice, and she squeezed gently, a silent communication that needed no words. After dinner, as the younger children played and the adults relaxed by the fire, Charles approached his father with a serious expression. "Pa, I've been thinking," he said, "about expanding my trap lines going further up into the high country. I want to establish a cabin up there, maybe start trading directly with some of the other trappers instead of always going through South Pass City." Cade considered his son's words carefully. "The high country's dangerous. More bears, harsher winters, harder living." "I know," Charles said. "But you taught me how to survive up there. You taught me everything I need to know. And I've got a family to provide for now, same as you did." Cade felt a swell of pride. His son had grown into exactly the kind of man he'd hoped he would be, strong and capable and willing to work hard for what he wanted. "Your mother and I started with nothing but a cabin and determination," he said. "If you think you're ready, then I'll help you build the cabin, get you set up proper." "Thank you, Pa," Charles said, his voice thick with emotion. "I hope I can build something half as good as what you and Ma have." "You will," Cade assured him. "You've got a good woman and a strong back. That's all you really need." As the evening wore on and the family began to settle in for the night, the younger children bedding down in the loft, the married couples in the various rooms that had been added over the years, Grace and Cade finally found themselves alone in their bedroom, the same room where they'd spent their first night as husband and wife. Grace sat at the small vanity Cade had built for her 10th anniversary, brushing out her long hair, still blonde though now streaked with silver. Cade watched her from the bed, still captivated by her grace and beauty after all these years. "What are you thinking about?" Grace asked, catching his eye in the mirror. "About how lucky I am," Cade said honestly. "About how different my life would be if I hadn't been checking my trap lines that day, if I hadn't seen you in the snow. I'd probably still be alone in this cabin, surviving but not really living." Grace set down her brush and came to sit beside him on the bed. "I think about that too sometimes. About how close we came to freezing to death, about how many things had to go exactly right for us to be here now. It feels like fate, like we were meant to find each other." "Maybe we were," Cade said, pulling her close. "Or maybe we just got lucky. Either way, I'm grateful for every day I've had with you." They lay down together, Grace curled against Cade's side the way she had on their wedding night and every night since. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, the wild music of the mountains. But inside the cabin, all was warm and safe and peaceful, a family at rest, a life well lived. The years continued to pass, marked by births and deaths, joys and sorrows, the natural rhythm of life in the mountains. Cade taught his grandsons to trap and hunt, passing on the skills that had kept him alive for so many years. Grace taught her granddaughters to cook and sew, and manage a household, but also to shoot straight and ride hard and never depend entirely on anyone else for their survival. When Cade turned 60, the family threw a celebration that brought people from all over the region. The homestead had become known as a place of wisdom and safety, and Cade and Grace had helped countless travelers over the years, offering shelter and food and guidance to those who needed it. "You're a legend," Timothy told him at the celebration, his own children playing nearby. "People tell stories about you, about the mountain man who built an empire with nothing but his hands and his heart." "It's not an empire," Cade protested. "It's just a home." "It's more than that," Timothy insisted. "You and Aunt Grace, you showed all of us what's possible when you work hard and love deeply. You built something that will last for generations." Cade looked around at the gathered crowd, at his children and grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had come to celebrate with him, and realized Timothy was right. He had built something lasting, something that would continue long after he was gone. Not an empire of wealth or power, but a legacy of love and family and hard work. Grace found him standing apart from the crowd, looking out over the valley they'd called home for so long. She slipped her hand into his, and they stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the mountains. "No regrets?" she asked softly. "Not a single one," Cade said. "You?" "Only that I didn't give my cloak away sooner," Grace said with a smile. "So I could have found you that much earlier." Cade laughed and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "We had the time we were meant to have, and we made the most of every moment." As the celebration continued around them, as their family laughed and danced and celebrated the life they'd built, Cade and Grace stood together and watched, their hearts full, their love as strong as the day they'd married. The mountain man had given his wife furs and warmth and a home in the wilderness. The woman had given her husband love and family, and a reason to believe in tomorrow. Together, they had built a life that would echo through the generations, a testament to the power of compassion and the enduring strength of true love. And when they finally passed, years later, peacefully in their sleep on the same night as if unwilling to be parted even in death, their children buried them on a hillside overlooking the valley with a simple marker that read, "Cade and Grace Yancey." They gave each other everything and left behind a legacy of love. The cabin still stands, maintained by their descendants, a monument to what can be built when two people find each other in the wilderness and choose to create something beautiful together. And on winter nights when the snow falls soft and quiet, some say you can still feel the warmth of their love radiating from those sturdy log walls, a warmth that will last for all time, eternal as the mountains themselves.